was a loud clanging sound, and sparks flew. The blade penetrated deep into the stone floor, and Tian, both hands gripping the sword, bowed his head and rested his forehead on the hilt. His teeth gritted so hard that they might grind into powder in his mouth. Chirang shouted and laughed out loud. Useless trash! What useless trash! I knew you wouldn't dare to kill me. No matter how much I ridicule you, no matter how I drag you through the mud, as long as I have a knife to someone else's throat, you can't do anything to me. You useless coward, for what do you need to live for, a god like you? However, Tian had already completely calmed down. He looked up, his eyes cold. Don't be too happy too soon. I can't do anything to you, but there will naturally be someone who can. Chirang humped. Are you thinking of hugging Junwu's legs to beg him to help you out again? Dream on. Did he care back then? And you still shamelessly follow his lead. Are you really that stupid? Tian peeled that stately and glamorous, God-pleasing costume set off of Chirang. He then called for Ruya, bound him, and threw him aside. You better keep your mouth shut, Tian told him. I'm not afraid of you. You've got nothing on me, Chirang retorted. Then, are you afraid of Huachang? Tian said. Chirang's smile froze for an instant, and in that instant, Tian said lightly, just to give you a heads up, if one of these days I get into a bad mood, maybe I just might hand you over to Huachang and have him think of a way to deal with you. So watch yourself, you hear me? Hearing this, Chirang couldn't laugh anymore. He said, terrified, what the f***? You're vicious. I can't believe you'd come up with something like that. Why not just hand me over to Lang Chencho? Tian knelt on the ground and used his hands to pick up small, coarse granules from under the coffin, one by one. Truthfully, he wouldn't be handing Chirang to the heavenly court for the time being. The reason was because of Lang Chencho. If he handed Chirang over and Lang Chencho learned of Chirang's whereabouts, he would charge immediately with his sword to kill him. Should he be killed? A headache. If he was killed, then what's next? Another headache. Thus, it wasn't wise to hand Chirang over to the heavenly court at the moment. All things considered, requesting Huachang's help seemed like a pretty good idea. But really, he was only using Huachang's name to scare Chirang a little. After all, he had already troubled Huachang too many times, and every time something happened, he'd think of Huachang first. It would almost be like he was being overly familiar. Just using his name to scare Chirang made Tian feel rather embarrassed. Chirang turned his head and spat some blood-laced spit in a different direction, and the child reached out pathetically to pat his forehead. Dad, are you okay? Does it hurt? He asked. Chirang seemed to really enjoy this game of father and son and responded derisively. My good son, Daddy is okay. He laughed. The rims of Tian's eyes were red as he picked up those granules and he placed them with the utmost care onto the God-pleasing costume. The child quietly crawled over and helped Tian pick them up. Tian saw those little hands and looked up at him, and the child said in a small voice, Gurga, won't you stop beating my dad up? Let us go. I won't steal from you again. Tian's heart tightened. He forced the feeling away. What's your name, little one? He asked. My name is Guzi, the child replied. Tian had finished collecting all the ashes and wrapped them in layers of that costume, tying it up neatly before placing the bundle within the coffin anew, closing the cover. He then slowly replied, Guzi, the one over there is not your dad, but someone else. Your dad has been possessed. He's currently a bad guy. The child couldn't comprehend what he had said and looked confused. Someone else? No, I recognize him. He's my dad. Chirang commented. Not bad, not bad. I've picked up a cheap son. What a great value." He laughed again. Shilian kicked him. Guzi was still young and had always lived dependent on his father, so he was quite attached to the body that Shirong had possessed, refusing to leave it alone. Shilian couldn't think of a way to take care of him for the moment. With the sword Feng Xin on his back, he kowtowed solemnly toward the two coffins thrice. Then, with Shirong hanging from his left hand and Guzi under his right arm, he left Mount Tesang, returning speedily back to Puchi village. By the time they made it back, it was deep into the night. The doors to the Puchi shrine were wide open, clouds of incense rolling out. Upon the altar, the incense burner was filled to the brim with sticks of incense, and the table itself was covered with offerings. Shilin entered, swept a look, and grabbed 2 meat buns from the altar. He passed one to Guzi and rudely stuffed the other into Chirong's mouth. That boy was alive, after all, and until Shilin figured out how to pull out Chirong from that man, he still needed sustenance. Chirong spat out the meat bun and cursed at how bad it tasted, then yelled, as if a little worried, "I say, you won't actually hand me over to Hua Chang, will you?" Shilin sneered. "Are you scared?" he asked. He didn't have time for this nonsense. He turned around to rummage through his pickle jars on the ground. Chirong was petulant. "Me? Scared? You should be the one who's scared. As a heavenly official, you dare to get so chummy with the Supreme. You..." As he talked, his eyes suddenly focused and locked onto something. Turns out, when Shilin bent down, something slipped out of the front of his robes. It was a crystal clear ring. That was what Chirong was staring at. Shilin didn't notice his gaze, but Chirong's face grew suspicious behind him. After a while, he spoke up. "Cousin Crown Prince, what's that thing on your chest?" Shilin was going to keep ignoring him, but what Chirong brought up was something he himself was curious about. He turned around, his finger hooking onto the thin silver chain. "This," he said. "Do you know what it is?" "Bring it here, let me see, and I'll tell you," Chirong beckoned. But Shilin said, "If you know, then say it. If you don't, then shut up." Chirong grumbled bitterly. "You're always so nasty to people who are close to you. If you're so amazing, why don't you go show off how cool you are to outsiders?" Shilin stuffed the silver chain back into the inner layers of his robe, pressing it against his skin and straightening it. "If you're so amazing, keep talking," he said. "Every word you say, I will keep count, and with every count, you'll be one step closer to Hua Chang's blade." Somehow, without him realizing, he'd gotten used to using Hua Chang's name. Chirong sneered. "Don't you use him to scare me. Maybe one of these days, you'll be the one dead under someone's blade. Don't you want to know what that is? I, who make part of the 4 Supremes, shall tell you. That's a cursed accessory, an object of misfortune. Hurry and throw it out. I can't believe you'd keep it on you. Think you've been living for too long?" Hearing this, Shilin straightened up instantly. "Is that true?" "Duh," Chirong said. "I'm telling you, whoever gave that to you, man or ghost, must not have good intentions." "Oh," Shilin said, and squatted down again. "What do you mean, oh?" Chirong cried. Shilin didn't bother turning to face him and said flatly, "Oh just means there must be a miracle for anyone to believe you. I choose to believe in the one who gave it to me. I've decided to keep wearing it on my person." Shilin had always been gentle and courteous to others, but to Chirong he was exceptionally cold. Chirong was furious, cursing non-stop, and Shilin only pretended to have heard nothing. He realized that he couldn't find the pot that contained Banyue, no matter how much he looked, and thought, perhaps the Wind Master already came by and took her away. As he listened to Chirong, he suddenly felt that something was off. Strange. Chirong was so obviously terrified of Hua Chang, so why was he trying to provoke him non-stop? as if he was intentionally trying to distract him. Realizing this, Shilian suddenly attacked. He whipped around to glare at Chirong, and sure enough, he saw his eyes avert for an instant, looking mighty suspicious. Shilian's gut instinct made him look up. He raised his head, and on the beams that weren't very high overhead, he saw a black-clothed man. The man had his back pressed against the ceiling, adhered above like a giant bat. Shilian immediately pulled out Feng Xin and hurled the sword up. That man was pressed onto the beam, and to dodge the attack, he flipped around and fell down. Guzi was so terrified, his meat bun fell to the ground, and he wailed. Just before Chirong could scream too, Roya sealed his mouth, dragged him to a corner, and bound him. Shilian had thought it was one of Chirong's planted lackeys at first, yet after a few quick parries, he noticed that this man was fast and aggressive, oddly familiar. He could say with absolute certainty that with Chirong's competence, he wouldn't have the power to subdue such a subject. Then he saw that there was something held in that man's other arm. Upon closer look, it was a black pot, and that pot was the very one that contained Banyue. The Windmaster hadn't taken Banyue away. Shilian instantly remembered who this was, and blurted out, "Little Pei." Turns out, Little Pei had come to steal Banyue away, but he unexpectedly bumped into Shilian, who'd just returned, and could only hide above on the wooden beam. Because Chirong was bound by Ruya, lying on the ground, he immediately saw Pei Su hiding above. He didn't know who that was, and had only thought that if it was something harmful to Shilian, it must be beneficial to him. He was afraid that Shilian would notice someone was lurking above, and purposely kept trying to distract him with noise. But who knew that Shilian would still notice? Shilian carried 2 cursed shackles, and Pei Su was in exile. Neither of the two had spiritual power, so they could only fight barehanded. Shilian had fought through his 800 years with nothing but his fists, so how could Pei Su possibly compete? It didn't take many rounds before Shilian subdued him. "Give back the pot," he cried. Shilian only shouted that randomly. Yet unexpectedly, Pei Su actually tossed the pickle pot back to him. Startled, Shilian thought, was General Pei Jr. really that easy? He'd return the pot just by being asked. Usually, wouldn't they have to push each other around for a bit longer? Yet, as Pei Su tossed him the pot, he also said in a low voice, "Hurry and go." By that tone, it sounded like he was quite anxious. That pot was still in mid-air, and Shilian was reaching out to catch it, when suddenly it changed course and flew out the window. The next second, they heard another man's voice coming from some distance away. "You've really disappointed me." Pei Su's face dropped. "General!" He and Shilian rushed out of the Puchi shrine. Sure enough, standing far away on the roof of a house was Pei Ming. He wasn't wearing his armor, and his robes were casual. He was tall and slender, bright like the sun. The very image of carefree. That pot leisurely flew next to Pei Ming, then stopped, floating. With a hand relaxed on the hilt of his sword, he spoke to Pei Su, who was standing below. "A man looks at the big picture and puts his career first. You're meant for great things, but what's going on? You'd mess yourself up for a little girl? Do you take yourself for an immature brat?" Pei Su hung his head low and didn't speak. Pei Ming added, "Did you think it was easy to obtain that position in just 200 years? I even paved the road for you. It's easy to go down, but it ain't easy coming back up." They say it's lonely at the top. However, when a god of heaven descended, they usually preferred finding high places to stand. The higher it was, the easier it would be to watch all that was below. Shilian used to have that bad habit. Of course, after he fell that one time, now, whenever he stood high up, he could feel his leg aching, and that bad habit went away. Yet the tallest building within Puchi village was the village head's house, and that house was a simple roof-tiled building. Having General Pei stand upon it really was doing him an injustice. However, that wasn't the point. The point was that with just a glance, Shilian knew what was going on. Last time, Pei Ming had the intent to push all the blame onto Banyue to clear Pei Su's name, and Shilian had stopped it. Although, in front of Junwu, Pei Ming appeared to have given up, he obviously hadn't abandoned the idea. This time, after Shilian's crummy business with the gilded banquet got out, he could barely take care of himself, and his reputation no doubt crashed. General Pei probably thought it was an opportune time to bring up old affairs, find Pei Su, and bring both him and Banyue back up to the heavenly court to appeal for a new trial. Truly relentless. However, Pei Su didn't seem overly thrilled at the prospect, and breathed a sigh. General, let's just forget about this whole affair. You, Pei Ming shouted. He looked speechless and exasperated. He must have been too frustrated to lecture Pei Su in front of Shilian. A moment later, he suddenly said, "Well, now I have to see just what kind of amazing girl could make all my hard work go down the drain." He reached out, seeming to want to shatter the pot. Such a way to open it shouldn't have been a problem. But the real problem was Shilian didn't know whether Banyue's wounds were healed. If not, and the pot shattered, it would be bad. Shilian's face dropped, and he leapt to charge. "Don't break it," he shouted. Unexpectedly, before Pei Ming's hand even touched the thing, there was a loud bang, and the pot exploded by itself. In an instant, the air was filled with the smell of pickles, strong enough to make a man suffer a mental breakdown. Pei Ming, who stood closest to the pot, was unfortunately covered with pickles all over, entirely flabbergasted by that pickle shower. Immediately after, the clear, sonorous voice of a woman rang in mid-air. "General Pei is such an honorable man." A white-robed individual flipped out of the small pot. At first, she was only the size of a fist, but the more she flipped, the bigger she became. Shilian looked closer and cried, "Lord Windmaster." The one hidden in the pickle pot wasn't Banyue, but Shiqing Xuan. She hid in the pot and blew a barrage of pickles at Pei Ming, but she herself was still all fluttering white robes, with not a spot of stain. She landed steadily, swung her whisk, and proclaimed, "Thank goodness, thank goodness. Good thing I already sent the little lady to someone else beforehand. Otherwise, she wouldn't have escaped the long reach of General Pei." Pei Ming prided himself on his charm, and no matter what, he had to keep his composure. Yet now, he stank of pickles, and even in the face of Shiqing Xuan in female form, he couldn't help but feel a little woeful. "Qing Xuan, why do you have to fight against me like this?" If it was anyone else, he probably would have beaten them to a pulp already. But just thinking of who Shiqing Xuan's older brother was, he could only pick off the pickles, brush back his hair, and grit his teeth. He shook his head. You better not let me find out just where you sent the little girl. Otherwise, I will certainly pay her a personal visit." The tone of voice was clear. Whoever dared take Banyue in was opposing him, and he would seek trouble. However, Shiqing Xuan clapped. "That's easy. It doesn't matter if I tell you where I sent her. I'd love to see you go visit. Listen well, that little girl is currently staying on Mount Yulong, in the cave right next to the Rainmaster's residence. You dare go?" At her words, Pei Ming's face dropped, and actually didn't look as confident as he did before. He schooled his expression and suddenly became serious. He said to the Windmaster, "Qing Xuan, you're still young. That's why you like to fight for justice over every little thing. Hopefully, when you get older, you won't regret the things you're doing now." After that, he leapt off the roof and his figure disappeared. He actually left in quite a hurry. Shilian was feeling bewildered and thought that his words contained hidden meaning. So he asked, Lord Windmaster, what did he mean? Shi Xuan, however, replied nonchalantly, nothing but empty threats. Pei Su watched Pei Ming's silhouette disappear before coming over to greet the other two. Lord Windmaster, Your Highness. Shi Xuan patted his shoulders. Little Pei, you need to come and stop your general this time. Very generous of you. Take good care of yourself down here and reflect properly. If there's a chance, I'll speak well of you in the heavenly court. Don't you worry. Pei Su was speechless for a moment, but still replied, Then, thank you, my lord. However, I still think you might have misunderstood something. General Pei isn't usually like this. And it was only because of what's happened previously that he was overly worried about me. Besides, you know too that the Rainmaster... He trailed off. In the end, Pei Su still felt he spoke too much. He shook his head and courted his hands. Farewell. The two of them watched him leave, and Shilian spoke up again. Lord Windmaster, the Lord Rainmaster you spoke of earlier, was it Rainmaster Huang? Shi Xuan turned back around and replied, That's right. The Rainmaster hasn't changed in centuries. What, is it someone you know? An acquaintance? Shilian shook his head and said softly, Although I haven't had the honor to meet the Rainmaster, I owe a debt and am profoundly grateful. Shi Xuan smiled. That's true. Although there aren't many who are acquainted with the Rainmaster, those who are have never spoken a bad word. Oh, except Pei Ming. Is there a dispute between them? Shilian asked. Naturally, Shi Xuan said. Those who have hung around the upper court for long all have some sort of dispute or deceit. Let me tell you that Rainmaster is a shadow in Pei Ming's heart. A shadow? Shilian wondered. In his mind, he always thought the Rainmaster was just someone who plowed fields. You know Pei Ming, Shi Xuan said. He's got plenty of descendants. His however many grandsons are everywhere. Before Little Pei, there used to be another deputy general at the palace of Guan, and it was also a descendant who was first appointed and then ascended. Shilian was amazed. General Pei sure has many talented descendants. Not just anyone could turn ascension into a simple homeschool lesson. Shi Xuan flashed her fan open and said, He was indeed a talent, but he was more or less the same as Pei Ming. Powerful, but also full of bad habits. That deputy official would often stir up trouble in other people's domain, but he had Pei Ming behind him, so no one dared say much. Until one day he messed around at the old residence in the kingdom of Yusha. The Lord Rainmaster rarely comes out and only plants fields deep in the mountains, so there's a nickname, Old Farmer of the Deep Mountains, Rainmaster Huang. But who knew that the moment the Rainmaster emerged, the descendant of Pei Ming was beaten to a pulp. He got dragged back to the heavens, thrown in front of the heavenly emperor, and got sentenced to exile. Why does this sound so familiar? Shilian thought. Shi Xuan continued. At first Pei Ming thought, why exile? Whatever, he could very well fish him back up in 100 years. But how much can happen in the mortal realm in a century? Every year, new and impressive talents appear like flashes of light. Wave after wave, you can barely keep count. It took only 10 years before all the devotees changed their idol. And after 50 years, that heavenly official was completely forgotten. After 100 years, he could no longer be recalled. The young heavenly official with a once boundless future was thus wasted. It wasn't until Little Pei came around that Pei Ming found another right hand that he liked. No wonder General Pei would do everything in his power to fish Little Pei back up. So there was a precedent, and he was afraid that Little Pei would go to waste too. Although his methods weren't quite right. Shilian mused, then sighed. The human world, he said. Shi Xuan agreed. Yeah, staying too long in the mortal realm will always wear down one's spirit and will. The two nodded to themselves. The difference, however, was Xuelian only nodded subconsciously, whereas Xuan was intentionally nodding in an exaggerated manner. After nodding for a while, Xuelian suddenly remembered an incredibly important individual. He called out, "Lang Ying, that child." Too many things had happened all at once. The excitement was too great, and he had forgotten about the child. Xuan piped up, "Are you talking about the child you brought back from Paradise Manor? The Heavenly Emperor has seen him, and he's currently at my place. I'll bring him down for you when I get the chance." Xuelian mentally noted, "There's still Qirong and another child locked up inside Puchi Shrine. I can't have anyone else see them." So he replied, "That'd be too much trouble. How about I go up instead?" Xuan nodded in delight. "Same difference," she said. "Coincidentally, it'll be the Mid-Autumn Festival banquet soon. It's a once-a-year event. You shouldn't miss it. This year, my brother will come back too. I'll introduce you." Her tone was full of pride for her own elder brother, and Xuelian couldn't help but smile, thinking, Mid-Autumn Festival banquet, huh? Every year, for the Mid-Autumn Festival, all of heaven would hold a banquet to celebrate, and watch the people of the mortal realm as entertainment. Other than that, there was also a very important game, played during the banquet, a sort of grand finale to the feast, called the Battle of the Lanterns. One blessing lantern couldn't be offered by just anyone. What the gods battled over during the Mid-Autumn Festival banquet was the number of those blessing lanterns offered by their devotees that each heavenly official would receive from their main temple. Although you would hear on everyone's lips, it was only a game, no need to take it seriously, we're just playing around, no need to mind. In reality, just how many really didn't care. The majority all secretly held their breath, hoping that this year their devotees would fight for them. If there really was one who didn't fight, it would only be Junwu, because obviously every year the great martial palace stood victorious, and the lanterns even increased year after year. Thus, he was the only heavenly official who truly took this game for a game. As for the other heavenly officials, they didn't fight for first place, only for second, and even then the competition was fierce. At the peak of the Palace of Shenna's prominence, it was also incomparably impressive, standing far ahead of the herd, alongside the great martial palace, leaving all the other heavenly officials in their dust. Now, it would probably look quite sad. Xuelian didn't even need to guess to know how many of those blessing lanterns he'd get. Definitely not a single one.